Good morning, everyone. I hope you slept well. We are very excited to kick off the day with a panel on global priority national progress, perspectives on AI policy. Lord Tim Clement-Jones, thank you so much for starting off the morning. I think you covered many, many important themes from interoperability, which we'll be talking about earlier, but the note you made there about governance and potentially regulation not necessarily being contrary to innovation, but to some extent supporting it. And so we want to dig into some of these questions this morning. And so I'm very pleased to invite four panelists to the stage. Wan Sie Lee, who is the Director of Data-Driven Tech at Singapore's Infocom Media Development Authority. Good morning. Mark Boris Andrijanic, who's, oh wow, you know, it's always great. I'm always impressed when people can pronounce my surname, so I'm glad that I got that correct. He's the VP at Kumo.ai, is a deep learning venture-based org in California, but he was previously Slovenia's first ever minister for digital transformation. So we're very delighted to have you join us, Mark. Michael Schönstein, who is the head of digital policy at the German Federal Chancellery, where he develops and implements strategy and policy at the intersection of digital innovation and social policy. One of our speakers will be joining us slightly late, but we will hopefully have Will Cutler, who's the head of tech policy and the deputy UK tech envoy from the UK government, join the panel within the next few minutes. So with those introductions, I'm happy to sort of kick us off. I think yesterday we discussed a lot about the various policy developments that we've seen in this space, and Lord Tim Clement-Jones, I think you did an excellent job of sort of summarizing those, including the G7 processes. You would have seen, for example, that the G7 from the EU side even just issued a call for evidence in relation to the code of conduct that they are developing. So a lot is happening, and I think that we are all very busy responding to the various requests for information and evidence from various governments. But a question for you guys, because I think that the space has transformed quite significantly. And so how does AI rank, I think, for you guys within your various jurisdictions? And specifically, if we were to look at the AI policy in your countries in 2021 versus 2023 now, what differences do you think we would see in that policy and why? Let's start with you, Wan Sie.
Use the microphone from this side, actually. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm very happy to be here. So the question is, what has changed, right, since 2021 and now? I mean, all of us in the room, as policy geeks, will know that lots have changed, right? So much has changed. I mean, it's been crazy. And I think every day I'm very grateful to be actually working in this space. It's a privilege to be in something that's moving so quickly, and it's really exciting. What has changed for Singapore, actually, it's interesting to see how we can contribute actually a lot more to what's happening in the world. We have, you know, the UK doing the AI Summit next week, right? And there's going to be a lot of conversations around you know, frontier models, how do you assess capabilities, how can we work together to build a technical capacity, not just in model labs, in AI labs, but also in governments, right? How do we collaborate on that space, and how do we collaborate in governance? When we talk about frontier model development, it's not just about what's happening domestically, but it's internationally. I think that's definitely something that we have to work closely on. If you want to use levers like compute, right, to govern, you can't have some governments saying yes and some governments saying no, right? So that's where I think international governments have to, or collaboration and governments have to come in. But actually at the domestic level, I think we've also looked at what can we do more of. Because it's not just about the model developers and the models that are coming out, but it's also about how these are being used in society and in industry. Then how then do we address some of the context specificity, right? And the culture and the values and use cases that's going to be relevant in Singapore, for example. in other countries. And that's not going to be general. That's going to be pretty specific. I was just having a call this morning with my team, and we were doing some red teaming on one of the big models, and we realized that, hey, it's biased against, like, let's say, one of the races in Singapore, right? And we didn't have to do that much in terms of adversarial red teaming work to sort of elicit that kind of responses from the models. And this is not going to be something that you would see in a research paper. This is not something that model developers will be thinking about, when they do general benchmarks and evaluations. So these are things that we have to be concerned about as well. So on the one level, at the frontier space, international collaboration, let's work together on technical as well as governance capacity. On another level, at the domestic, kind of looking at how this applies to our industry, to our society, I think we also have to do quite a lot of work. But even at that level, I think there's a lot of international collaboration. We recently did a mapping with NIST on our framework and what NIST AI RMF is one of the first ones from a sort of G2G level mapping. And it shows that it's important that we have alignment and interoperability, even at looking at the nuts and bolts of what is transparency, what is explainability, how does this apply in terms of responsible implementation. And so I think that's quite a lot of things that's happening. I'm just highlighting a couple of them, and I'm happy to talk more later. Thanks.
I'm always so impressed with Singapore. Every time I'm always impressed with you guys. Fantastic. I think it's interesting as well that you specifically mentioned frontier as a sort of international collaboration area. And I know that we'll come back to that on this panel, but also throughout the day. Michael, why don't we come to you next? How would you categorize the sort of space in 2021 versus now in Germany, but again, also more widely at the European level for you?
Yeah, thank you. Also, thanks for having me here. It's a wonderful event. I'll try to get to both aspects here: the priority and the changes since 2021. I think there's two elements that have been driving change since 2021. The first one is, of course, technological developments. We see a lot more focus on foundation models. Since the release of ChatGPT, because that has caused political attention and focused it. And I think that's been a driver of change in attention and in focus of AI policy. That's one thing. The other element of change, I think, is something I would say is perhaps politics versus policy. And there, I think, it's important to remind ourselves here, where we have a lot of people working on AI policy specifically, that of course that doesn't happen in isolation from other world events. And clearly, when we look at the time frame since 2021 to now, there have been longer trends ongoing. The climate crisis, I think, is becoming more immediate every day. We see that, but we also see what our chancellor has called a sea change, Zeitenwende, because of the Russian war of aggression. And we had timid mentions of geopolitical situation yesterday, and I think we just need to be honest that it's not a situation, it's a paradigm change. So when we talk about AI policy, I think we need to be very aware that in the background of AI policy, there's a lot of politics going on, and the value or the priorities that we give to any single AI policy is determined, at least by our decision makers, to a large extent by how much or not they pay into the transformational goals that arise from the political background, the climate transition, the sea change that we're in geopolitically, but also, of course, ongoing, oldies but goldies, such as demographic change. This is very important. We also heard yesterday what matters with artificial intelligence, not that we just have more of it as an end to itself, but it needs to make people's lives better. So, of course, that's where the priorities come from. And that's what I would say is also this politicization, I think, of the space around AI policy. That's what I would consider the biggest change that we've seen, and the prioritizations that we derive from that.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael. Mark, we'll come to you next, because I think that you bring sort of two hats to this discussion as a sort of digital minister in a sort of first space in 2021, but now, of course, you're sort of coming at this from an industry perspective. How have you sort of seen this space change? And I think, Michael, you mentioned some important points there around politicization. What would this look like from your perspective?
Thanks so much. It's great to be here. Let me first say that 2021 feels like a totally another era. We were already living in an AI era, we just didn't realize it. I think we realized it in November 2022 when ChatGPT was launched. Now, I remember in April of 2021, the European Commission published the first draft of the AI Act. Now, obviously, this was an important draft in the European terms and also globally, but it wasn't really central to the European digital strategy or the new regulatory framework that were slowly emerging. Back then, greater focus was on Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act. The first one, obviously, regulating big social media platforms, especially in the area of content moderation, and the latter one dealing with market concentration in the tech industry. So at the time, obviously this was an important part of the agenda, but not the most important one. So during the Slovenian EU presidency in the second half of 2021, most of our efforts, or most of my efforts, were focused on getting an agreement between the member states on DSA and DMA, and making some progress on the AI Act, obviously. Now, I think one thing that surprises me still is that despite all the rhetorics, despite all the fuss, despite all the conferences, we're not really seeing a regulatory revolution in the AI space. You know, on one hand, we do have an AI revolution in the technological space, but in the regulatory sense, we have a slow-moving regulatory evolution, with very few jurisdictions opting for mandatory rules and regulations. The EU obviously comes to mind, Canada as well, but most others are opting for a softer touch approach, favoring policy guidelines or, you know, voluntary codes of conduct. Now, during this discussion, especially in the EU, we started to realize that the emergence of AI is basically strengthening the gap between the US and China on one hand and the rest of the world. I'm talking about an R&D, I'm talking about technological gap. It seems like, you know, we haven't been focused enough on how do we stay competitive? How do we make sure that the tech world of, you know, tomorrow won't look pretty much like the tech world of today? And we've seen an amazing divergence in the R&D area in the past 10 years. If 10 years ago, most of the significant machine learning models were released by the academia, today it's all about the industry. The industry releases 10 times more significant machine learning models than the academia, simply because it takes a lot of data, a lot of compute power, and a lot of talent, and it all costs money to do that. Which means that, you know, for us, I think an important question is, how do we strengthen our academia in terms of research and innovation? How do we empower our own startups and SMEs so that, you know, the AI will help empower them rather than monopolize the areas where Europe and other jurisdictions remain competitive?
Awesome. Thanks so much, Mark. And we'll come back to this different sort of jurisdictional approach, actually, because I think you mentioned some important points there from a sort of SME perspective, which also varies across Europe. So we'll actually break down Germany and Slovenian perspectives in a second. But Wan Sie, you mentioned some important points, including around you guys working with NIST on the RMF. And I think we just recently saw the outcomes of the US-Singapore Critical and Emerging Technology agreement. I think this was announced, was it about a week ago? Yeah. A week ago, which is great, really great to see. I think in June we also discussed at our meetings, we had Singapore sort of share a lot of the work that they're doing on generative AI. So based on these sort of developments recently, how would you frame your current AI priorities? And where do you see them aligning or diverging with the US? But also wider international partners, so specifically with the US. You've put a lot of focus on the US collaboration. Do you see you guys aligning in most areas, but are there some things you would point to differently?
Well, with the US, I mean, one of the things that we need to recognize in Singapore is that we know we are small, right? And we know that we have to partner work with countries all over the world. So it's not just the US. We're happy to partner. I mean, we're going to have a conversation in the UK next week when we're in town to talk about collaboration. And we have been having these conversations with also other countries like Japan and so on. It's been ongoing for a few years. With the US, it's important also because, number one, a lot of the model developers are in the US. So a lot of the US kind of implementations from the White House in terms of voluntary commitments and all that is going to be useful in sort of driving certain kind of coherence and alignment with the model developers, right? So where we think it's important then is to say how can we contribute to that process? It's not about competing with other countries, it's about how do we support one another. So we have ideas, because we're small, less influential, but also a lot more nimble. So we do a lot of work in terms of experiments, trying new things. That's why we say, hey, let's do the mapping. It's a way to sort of show how to move conversations forward. So that it's not just at that high level where we just say, hey, let's rely on principles, let's interoperate, but what does that mean? What does that look like, right? So that's why I think it's important that we contribute to that process, and that's how we're having this conversation with the US. And we'll be keen to see how we can take that collaboration forward in other areas of model development. Yeah.
Awesome, thanks so much, Wan Sie. Keen to know from you guys, and hopefully in the Q&A you can poke each of them about where they see the differences between the panel. But Michael, for now, we'll focus on the EU trilogue. So I'm sure everyone's sort of following the trilogue negotiations. We have been engaging very closely with the Commission and the Parliament, who are sort of in attendance at our June Partner Forum meeting, but they are live negotiating the trilogue today. We've seen them, from what we know, the trilogue negotiations have been really successful in a few areas, including on a lot of the technical tools. So from what we understand, there's been agreement on the sort of technical standards, the assurance parts. But when it comes to sort of general purpose AI and provisions around foundation models, there are still many open questions from what we understand. So Michael, how would you frame the priorities in the trilogue overall? But specifically, again, I guess the EU is a large regional bloc. What do you see as the areas that are particularly important for Germany within those trilogue negotiations?
Well, this is the point where I have to say what you hear now is my personal opinion and not necessarily a reflection of the position of Olaf Scholz or the Chancellery or the federal government. That being said, I think we see the open areas that are up for negotiation now, and I really don't want to comment on that while they're ongoing. But I do think that the three open questions around high-risk areas, around the bans, especially biometric identification, and foundation models, generative AI, general-purpose AI, all that mixed into one big bag. Those are the three that I think determine the trilogue at this point. In terms of priorities, let's maybe say concerns at this point. I think by now, of course, we're down to the last issues. Those are the most important ones, the most tricky ones. If they weren't, they'd been resolved already. That said, I think the time has come that we start thinking a bit more downstream from what we're doing in the AI Act, and that's something that's very much on the forefront of our concerns right now. How and when can we begin speaking concretely about implementing and enforcing all of the regulations that we're looking at? And Mark, I'm really grateful that you mentioned some of the other ones that are going on as well, because I think we have, yes, of course we have the AI Act, but the AI Act is not the only legislative project in the digital space at the European level that has something to do with artificial intelligence. I think the Digital Services Act, and many people forget the liability legislation that's ongoing as well, will have tremendous impact. The Data Act is being finalized soon as well. And of course, we have the GDPR around. So I think it is very, very important that we begin moving our attention a little bit to implementation and to creating, both at the European and at the national level, structures for enforcement that actually live up to the intention that we want to be innovation friendly, because that's something that doesn't only happen in the legal text, that actually happens in everyday interactions, especially between businesses and regulators. And I think there we really need to be careful right now that we don't forget to take the perspectives of both businesses and civil society, citizens, into account more when as they interact with the regulation. So let me just make one brief example here. Imagine you're a larger, medium-sized company and you introduce a new ERP system that claims to have some artificial intelligence embedded in it. You need to deal with GDPR, at least for your human resources data. Most likely you will have some touch point with the Data Act as it concerns your supply chain. There may or may not, depending who you purchase it from, any of the other acts that you also mentioned, playing in. We're not entirely sure that for the same issues, all of those actually use the same taxonomies. That's the first point. The second point is, how many agencies do you need to deal with? How many processes do you need to comply with in order to actually complete your ERP, the introduction of your ERP system? And that has not even, and there I haven't even talked about idiosyncratic rules in different countries about co-determination of workers through works councils, etc., that are very important in our view as well. And so I think it's very important that as we go on with the AI Act negotiations, we now really start thinking about what does this look like in the real world.
Awesome. You mentioned a few points that we'll actually come back to on the next panel. But while we're sort of on this point around thinking about national jurisdictions under the EU, Mark, why don't we come to you next from a Slovenian perspective? Because when we consider regional policy, right, we often think about it as a block, but at the end of the day, it will be sort of implemented by notified bodies, by regulators within specific jurisdictions under the EU. And it might impact countries differently, right? Germany and Slovenia, for example, differently. So as you sort of look to the AI Act, and from your experience as a minister in Slovenia, what do you think will be the important points that Slovenia is probably thinking about in terms of the impact of the Act within your specific jurisdiction?
Let me just add one thing about the ongoing EU trialogues. I'm pretty sure the compromise will be reached sometime between midnight and 2 a.m. on the last day of negotiations in a typical Brussels fashion. Now, and then comes the implementation, and that's really the important part. Thanks so much for bringing it up. Simply because, there'll be so many secondary pieces of legislation that will really define the burden of compliance, again, for SMEs and startups. And here I must say that many of them are quite pessimistic. According to one of the surveys, half of European startups that were part of this research thought that the EU Act will slow down AI innovation in Europe. Cheers. 17% of them even considers moving their AI R&D outside the EU. Now, it's really at this point difficult to say whether these fears are justified or not, but there's a clear lack of communication. And I come from the big tech, but I gotta say one thing, the big tech can burden any kind of compliance cost. They can afford the best compliance lawyers, legions of them if needed. That's not the case for pretty much everyone else. And this is what regulators really need to keep in mind. Today, I work for a fast-moving AI startup. Compliance is the last thing we're focused on, because we need to build a product, we need to innovate, we need to find the product market fit, and so on and so forth. So it's really important that, once the regulations are adopted, the policymakers and the regulators, as well as the enforcers, explain them in terms that are understandable, not just to a fellow lawyer, but to a startup founder. This for me is super important. When it comes to the opportunities, Slovenia, will try to be a Singapore of Europe. Small, nimble, agile. We host UNESCO's AI Center. We are world-renowned builders of mobile games. We'll try to find our niche. And I think Europe as well will have to find its own niches, because clearly we can't compete on everything with everyone, despite our scale.
Awesome. And hi, Will. Thank you so much. No worries. Actually, we'll come back to you in a second, because while we're on the theme of regional policy, Wan Sie, we'll come to you first. Because I think we often talk about the EU, but there are other regional blocs and organizations, including ASEAN, for example, the Association of... There we go. And I think that it's important to consider that. So are there any regional policies in the ASEAN region by the regional bloc or by your neighboring countries, without naming any specifically, that will inform Singapore's approach? Because I think, of course, you will be thinking about the trading partners in the region, but also ASEAN might have specific policies that Singapore is really thinking about aligning with.
Yeah. Is this working? Yeah, cool. ASEAN, maybe just to introduce ASEAN to the rest of the audience, is Association for Southeast Asian Nations. So it's 10 countries.
Is the mic on?
Is it on? Yeah, yeah. Sounds like it's not on, but yeah, it is. Apparently they can hear me, so that's fine. Association of Southeast Asian Nations, it's about 600 million people in the ASEAN sort of grouping. That's a big group and it's growing. It's a very young population, it's growing. So it's an interesting market for lots of companies as well. So what we try to do is try and get some kind of alignment and minimize the fragmentation within ASEAN. It's difficult. I'll be upfront to say it's not easy. I mean, it's not like the EU. We do not have a common legislation or legislative kind of approach to our regulations. It's essentially a fairly loose loose grouping of countries in the same region. What we have done in Singapore is, rather than have ASEAN influence our policies, we use our policies to influence ASEAN. And we worked with our ASEAN neighbors to come up with guidelines for AI. At this level, it's fairly general, but we're hoping that to use that as a way to sort of talk about same terminology, same ideas, same principles, and then when they translate that into domestic policies in ASEAN, then at least there's some consistency. But I wanted to not just leave it at the regional kind of alignment, but it's also about other kind of groupings, right? I feel like I'm the only non-European kind of country on this panel, so I should really talk about like beyond Europe a little bit. And we're also small. So Singapore also tries and do a lot of work with other small countries. So we have this forum called the Digital Force, so Forum of Small States, Digital Forum of Small States. And it's 100 over countries, very small countries coming together to talk about how then do we have some kind of, using our grouping, right, have some kind of heft. Because otherwise, individually, we are really tiny, right? And building capacity then in that space. And again, then moving forward to say, what does that mean in different types of groupings? And Singapore tries then to do a lot more work in this space as well, leading and sharing our experiences, I think mostly about sharing experiences, and then hopefully then minimizing fragmentation.
Awesome, thanks so much, Wan Sie. And we're very, very pleased to have Singapore. And I think we mentioned this yesterday. Global equity is just like something that's so important to us. We do know that the US and the EU often dominate a lot of the conversation, but I think that it's something that we want to do more of. So hopefully at the next policy forum, we will have even more sort of countries sort of represented and engaging on our sessions. If the team will allow me, if I'm allowed to say this, since Will has just joined, we'll spend just a few more minutes sort of diving into the UK, and then we'll jump to Q&A. So please, folks, have questions ready for the panelists. So Will, thank you so much for being here with us today. We'll just, drop you right in there. When it comes to country policies at the moment, countries are, of course, taking different approaches, and what we've seen with the UK and the upcoming Safety Summit is specific focus on frontier models. If anyone wants to offer a definition for frontier in the audience, please feel free to do so in the Q&A. Although I know that the UK is hoping to build some consensus around that. what would you say the opportunities and trade-offs with trying to narrow down or focus on a specific problem area or model type to some extent? And I guess why has the UK taken that approach?
Sure. Thank you. That's my most rock and roll entry to a panel. As rock and roll as you can get in an AI summit. The AI summit. I don't know if anyone's aware that there's a safety summit happening next week, which we're really, really excited about. And as you mentioned, Steph, we've focused it on frontier AI risks, and we talk about what we mean by those. And it's quite a deliberate decision to have focused on that, partly because there's so many other conferences and so many other fora that are bringing together different countries to look at AI responsibility in the round. OECD, GPAI, the Hiroshima process. So we tried to find something that was different to differentiate the conversation. And we saw a real opportunity to bring together a broader set of countries. There'll be about 25 countries at the Safety Summit next week, represented at cabinet level, and then a narrow discussion with leaders on the second day. And by focusing on frontier AI safety, we think we can have the goal is to have a collective conversation about some of the risks that are being, different countries are more alive to, some less so. So we really want to have convergence on the sort of narrow subset of risks, things like misuse, things like cyber attacks, biosecurity, where people are using these really powerful models to do, the opposite of what we all want them to get from them. And it's a real focus on understanding collectively what those risks are and what some of the mitigations should be to address them. And the reason we're doing that is because we really want to see the benefits. We worry that some of the models that might be produced next year, when lots of companies with lots of compute, lots of shiny H100s sort of landing on the happy AI researchers' desks, or the data centers, are giving them more capabilities to build ever more powerful models. And we've got this moment in time where we can collectively understand what these risks will be. We've got the time to develop new evaluations to understand and quantify those risks. And so by focusing on those, we think we can bring a broader grouping of countries to address them. So it's important to have that conversation. And we think we can get to make meaningful progress more quickly by focusing on those subset of risks. So it's partly about having a broader conversation. By focusing on a narrow area, you can bring more people on board. If I think of a hierarchy or a sort of spectrum of different type of risks that we see, on the one end you've kind of got existential runaway AI sort of scenarios where we can all trade different thought experiments on them, but it's all focused on the technology, all the way through to kind of misuse risks, deception, and then sort of ethical sort of considerations and bias and everything. So I think as you kind of, in my mind, as you go down that spectrum, you don't go down in terms of any sort of level of importance, but they're all important. We have to kind of tackle all of those things. But what you do get is more subjectivity, more kind of opportunity for countries to interpret those things differently based on their values. So we want to focus on the ones where we can all agree we don't want to see misuse. We don't want to see terrorists, using these technologies for bad purposes. That's something that we think all countries can agree on. And so by focusing on those, we can build that consensus. And one of the outcomes that we want to get to is that we kind of have this sort of effective empiricism, where we're really focused on the scientific understanding of what the capabilities are that we need to be worried about, and create a framework where we can collaborate internationally with partners to understand those risks. It will start with frontier risks, but I think there's loads of opportunity to take some of the structures that we hope to put in place, and we'll have the conversations next week and see where we get to. But I'm quite hopeful that we will find a broad coalition of countries that want to work together on some of these issues, both on the frontier risks, but then also on just wider questions where there are open scientific questions about alignment, about interpretability, explainability, that we can then address collectively. So
awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks, Will. I have another follow-up question, but instead we'll go to Q&A, but I will leave it with you, which is, even within that sort of coalition of partners, where do you sort of expect to see, I think, convergence? So which partners do you expect there to be immediate alignment with, and where do you potentially expect to see divergence? But with that, why don't we go to Q&A and see if anyone has any immediate questions?